All right, it's 3 o'clock. You are hopefully here for a discussion of long-term support. Everybody in the right place? Everybody have their flame retardant suits and raw vegetables? So I want this to mostly be discussion, but I wanted to kind of do a little bit of setting the initial stage just to talk about it. So I'm guessing that everybody's here has some sense of what the initials LTS mean, but we try to sum it up as a documented support policy. And one of the things that's then come up more recently is our current state is underdocumented. So Jordan's been working on that. And then the L obviously stands for long, but the idea that there's going to be something for a length and type of support. And people have their preconceptions of what that may be. It could be something like certain types of bug fixes for a couple of years, or some of one type for a shorter period, and then some other tail. But there's different schemes. The key is that you define one, and you make sure that you match it to what your user base wants, what your developer community is capable of. And then L long, typically 1 year or more, is what people are used to, I think, in industry. Different, obviously, than what we're doing here. And within that juxtaposition, you start to get into the controversy. So, benefits. Users, vendors, developers could have some benefits from having a better defined support stance. I think that much is at least clear and not so contentious. But these also come at a cost. So human staffing is a current issue, test matrix, or even just test stability today in the first place, much less, we don't want to grow dramatically our test matrix if it's already unstable, right? Like we have issues that we need to deal with ahead of this, so like this in some ways feels like a distraction, but at the same time, users are asking for something different than what we have today. So if we don't start planning and thinking about it now, in a few more months, once Aaron's fixed all the test flakes, then we won't be ready to solve this problem next, right? So, so I guess I'm kind of here as tribute to start driving these conversations a little more formally in the community. And I work at VMware. We have an interest in this. We have users who want support. Obviously, our customer base is used to that much more traditional type of long-term support, but then we have to help figure out how we balance that versus what they want and what the community is doing, and then contribute to it. So I'm not just here to get flamed and raw vegetables thrown at me. I actually have a desire to see something constructive here. And I have my personal biases as well. So I'm going to try to be a moderator in discussion today, but I will also probably express opinions, not necessarily VMware's opinions, personal engineer ones, as I hope all of you do, that we do this with an open mind for how we manage these complexities. So the first thing then to mention, or the last thing that I'll mention, is where are we? So we've had some initial discussions about this. We've gotten agreement that yes, a working group makes sense to do for this. We've put up a PR. There's what for the chairs or leads, whatever you call them now, for working group organizers. What we think of as roughly a reasonable mission for this group is out there. It's more or less ready, we think, for steering to review and sign off on. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at that, comment if you think otherwise. Let's fix it, let's iterate. Otherwise, LGTM also would be awesome, just to make it clear that people are thinking about that. And then kind of going back to my comment about keeping an open mind and trying to understand what we might do differently, one of our first steps is just to start collecting information. So we're drafting a survey. We want to take this out both to the internal developer community around Kubernetes, but also users, vendors, distributors, and try to understand what people are looking for and why. And hopefully do that in a way that's a little more sophisticated than, hey, do you want LTS? Yes. That we actually get at, because a lot of end users out there are going to say yes, but a lot of us have reasons for thinking that we could do something different or better than that potentially. There's two modes in the distribution of where customers are, ones that are moving quickly and ones that are not. And there's maybe not one technical solution to the two. We need to figure out a path. So that is out there. We'd love more involvement shaping that. We'd like to kind of get it nailed down a little more in the coming weeks and start getting it out there for specific feedback. And then finally, SIG Cluster Lifecycle also has a survey out similarly, and it has some questions that touch on this area as well. I think, like Tim mentioned earlier in the Contrib Summit, like between SIG release, SIG testing, cluster lifecycle, the operational reality of this day-to-day is cluster lifecycle. So even if we didn't have this working group, they would be struggling through some of these things on their own. And I think if we can bring in other SIGs and more perspectives, hopefully we can do something better as a community. So I'd encourage you guys to get involved in providing input to the existing surveys, helping draft the other survey, the charter. And then I wanted to kind of open things up to conversations about where people think we should head, because the charter isn't quite merged yet, right? So we still have some questions of scope. And
so maybe it's a little too early to start with this, but I'll throw out, since Jago's sitting right next to me, I'll throw out the straw man that the goal ought to be making upgrading a far less painful experience, because there are concerns that their LTS can imply or signify a desire to stop changing, deploying, upgrading, whatever. So hang on. So I think like Jordan, for example, gave a great thesis for why we do not want to slow down that particular velocity, because to roll out API changes in a way that are non-disruptive to end users and allow both forwards and backwards migration, you actually have to do this across 3 different releases or 3 different versions. And if we reduce...
At a minimum, right?
At a minimum, and if we reduce that cadence, that's going to make it extraordinarily painful to roll out new features that rely on new API fields. You could potentially argue that maybe we should drop the 1 from Kubernetes 1.14.0 and just say what we now call the minor version is actually the major version, and that's the thing that we are committed to supporting a little more long term. Because today we talk about patch releases, like 1.13.1 will be the actual release of 1.13 that everybody will use, because that's the patch release that fixes all of the bugs. But historically, those haven't been patch releases. Regressions have snuck in, and things that are more than just bug fixes have also snuck in. Maybe we should call those what those are, which are minor releases. Anyway, I just want to throw that as, I think that's the complete other end of the spectrum from LTS, is there should be no such thing as LTS. If we reduce our velocity, that's going to harm us as a community even more.
The definition of support was lacking in that slide. I think it said you articulate it, but it's not enough to say like what it is you're backporting, but also the requirement that there's a forward path as well is part of the support.
I think one of the things that I didn't write up in my proposal, and I promised to you and to other group that like other systems have had this problem before. This is not a unique set of problems. They have solved it by having like 2 streams, by having a devel and stable series, right? And because the unique requirements of a lot of people that are in the wild, they only have a certain limited outage window for them to do upgrades. And like history on OpenShift and history at Heptio has made me very empathetic to their situation. These are operators who, once they get it qualified, they're too busy trying to like just make sure that the world doesn't light on fire, right? And they only have an outage window of maybe like a day, a quarter at best, right, to actually get an upgrade in?
Except I think I should add just on that Kubernetes is a bit different. This is not a kernel that you have to reboot with an outage window in order to upgrade. This is, we've built a thing that's meant to be high availability. You're meant to be able to do upgrades without downtime, like with 0 downtime, not just small downtime, which is a little special in the scheme of computer science history. So theoretically, we could say that, yes, you are still expected to do quarterly upgrades even on your mega production. You're running Google on this data center.
Hey, as you speak, could you throw your name out there for folks who aren't aware? So,
That's Gus, for posterity.
and that was Tim St. Clair. I don't think I introduced myself to maybe even Tim Pepper
And this is Aaron Quickenberger of Sigbeard. I am Jago McLeod, and I work a lot on the GKE fleet management, rolling out upgrades across lots of clusters. And a few things a few thoughts I've had along the way. The critical risk I see in an LTS version is that it becomes a hard fork that will never converge. It becomes the Python 2.7 to the corresponding 3.x fork in that road. And I think in order to address that, any working group has to have in scope what happens at the end of the deferred maintenance that we are taking on. That is, either you're stacking up several minor upgrades at the end of it and catching up through the same path that the other channel went, or we build the real migration tools to spin up a new cluster and migrate existing workloads from the end of that LTS to the next one of those. I think those are possibilities. There are likely lots more, but that's the thing that I immediately jump to when we talk about LTS is what happens at the end. I think more fundamentally, before I give up the mic, I think it's disingenuous of us as a community to suggest to enterprises that they can containerize all of their running legacy workloads and get it just right and then not touch it anymore. And I think the really hard problem is that this is fundamentally a different way to run software. And even those of us in this room who own all of the pieces are not in control of all of the pieces. These systems continuously evolve, continuously change. The infrastructure that we run on and assume within Google, we do live migrations of VMs, these things, I don't know when they're happening. Networks get updated, things happen between A and B. And being able to evolve and have smaller amount of targeted downtime over time, it's like this dynamic stability that's very uncomfortable for many enterprises, but really is the whole benefit that we all sell in our sales pitches. And so I would encourage us to look to what are the problems in a year going to be, not what are the problems of a year ago. And the thing I bring up is that it is impossible for any Kubernetes distribution to depend only on stable APIs. And so there are no backwards compatibility guarantees. And we move things from annotations to fields. And we do break customers across even patch releases, but especially minor release upgrades. And so what I would like to see in this is how do we meet the needs of customers to safely adopt this world of change and embrace it. And one of those targets should be stable APIs for everything you really need by the end of 2019. And in that world, do we need LTS or an alternative to call each minor a major upgrade? Can we pull the ultimate coup and say 1.x is the stable LTS, and each one of those minor releases is a, what do they call it, a patch, patch release? No, but it's a security patch. It's a, what does Windows call it? They have a service pack. There you go. It's a service pack. And then the auditors, and this is the really critical one to work out, is that these enterprises have to go through compliance auditing, and we can't blow that for them. So those are some thoughts.
Does anyone want to comment before?
Hi everyone, Yassine. I think we can like have a solution that gets compromised. Users usually can't upgrade for reasons, and usually users want to have clusters that gets patched. So maybe we can have an LTS that actually says like okay, this version will get all the cherry picks and all the patches in it, but just the patches, nothing more. This might be an idea of an LTS, just a version of Kubernetes that gets patched against vulnerabilities and bugs.
That's an area that I think is relatively easy for us to start doing better on. So I've volunteered along with Alexandra Malinowska from Google as patch release manager for 1.13, and our hope is then to build that into a sort of more of a team role, where historically one individual was the gatekeeper on that stable branch for its 9-month lifetime. And there's almost zero documentation of what's expected of the person in that role. And we talk about like security fixes only or critical fixes only, but it's very much a hand-wavy list right now, and it's on one person's very subjective shoulders to let things in. And in the face of SIG leads saying this is critical urgent, who are we as non-subject matter experts to say no, unless it's very obvious? But there's a huge gray area where, I mean, even just this week as we're planning 1.13.1, a lot of the stuff going by, we're like, we'd rather not take that, but it's in the cluster subdirectory and it's clearly needed for them and it's a mess.
I did kind of push back on things from the SIG that I was involved at the time, saying this is too big a change, I'm not happy with this going into the patch release. So
Remember to use
I've had the reverse experience, where I was trying to push back on something saying, I feel this is too big a change to backport, like we should know, just keep that for the new version. And then the release manager was the one saying the other way around, going, yeah, no, I'm totally fine putting that in, off you go. And I was like, oh, okay.
Was that me?
This was 2 years ago, so no, cool, 1 year ago.
I think as a community, we need to think about better defining some of those things day to day across all of the roles, whether it's a SIG lead having to make a choice or a release lead or, yeah, architecture.
So just for a data point, you know, I have a Kubernetes cluster that's 112 API server, and I've got 110 nodes that I haven't been able to upgrade yet because I have to roll all the workload forward to another node first because it won't do an in-place upgrade. But I've got singletons that if I actually roll them, then I'll take a downtime, and the particular service isn't really, it won't move that easily. So yeah, I've got a cluster pinned because I just can't take the downtime currently. So it happens even with kind of the more modern workloads. If it's not quite 100% modernized yet, it's easy to get in this position.
Any clarifying question on your use case?
Hi, I'm Bob Wise. I'm with AWS. When one of those nodes crashes, because it will crash at some point, what happens?
It'll fail over and it'll be fine, but I don't necessarily want to take the downtime now.
I'm sorry. When it crashes and then you recover it, you gonna recover it to a later version or recover it?
Oh, thanks, sorry.
Well, the workload could go to a newer node, and that's fine, but I don't necessarily want to take a data plane outage of the particular service unless I have to. It's one thing to say I'm taking a downtime purposefully. It's another thing that says, well, it crashed and it recovered, right?
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name is Phil Rock. I'm with Google. I had a question. Has it been discussed how, as Kubernetes moves to more like individual components and say, like kube control gets moved out, for instance, and then does independent release cycles, do each one of those components have their own LTS releases, or how is that coming together?
I think you cannot avoid what we are already becoming is a series of distributions. It is inevitable. Like, you're going to have a stream of products, and somebody's going to say stable and harden that stream of versions, and then give that as a distribution. And then the next version that they do upgrade for, it's going to be, you tag a stream. This is exactly like the distribution model.
So each component would decide what its LTS?
I think a provider would decide.
But I think the essence of what Phil's getting at is then you're essentially having a requirement on all participants in the Kubernetes ecosystem to also support this LTS version and a head or devel. Well, I mean, somehow, right? If you're claiming to an enterprise that this is the stable version of Kubernetes and it's somehow
As a distro, you have to have something that's cohesive. Whether that truly requires Kubernetes and etcd and everything to all declare that today's release is LTS across all of these so that we all have LTSs. I mean, I don't think That's not the case with Linux distros today. Like that doesn't happen, but the advantage that they have, I feel like, even going pretty far back in the history of Linux, is that things were already more stable across these components. We have this combinatorics, and all of the pieces are moving extremely fast, and many of them are very early and raw, and there's a bunch of turnover and churn as one thing gets displaced by another. So it's easy to see it becoming a distribution model, but how, like I would not want to be one of those distributors on a lot of days, because integration is hard, and all of these things are moving at really varying states. And you're not just going to be able to declare all of cloud native as LTS for today, and we're going to integrate that. All of us will integrate that one somehow. So Kubernetes, if it does something, would be probably largely doing it on its own, I think.
Yeah.
Like, some of the things that are part of Kubernetes, if they move out to their own components, then are they still part of Kubernetes? Like, for kube control, would it be possible that kube control is like, well, our API version skew semantics are ±1, and we're not doing LTS at this particular version, and then there's no LTS kube control, or do we need to enforce that kube control does support an LTS?
I think this group needs to decide, right? So one of the things I wanted to mention too is that I think you can still move fast and move slow, right? This is not a unique model. If you have a devel stream that released every single month and actually got beta testers, this is the way other configuration or cluster management systems actually work. They have a devel stream, prototype people who want to bleed on the edge, install it as devel clusters in the wild, right? Because no one installs a beta release of Kubernetes. Like absolutely no one. But if you had a devel stream that was being published, they would actually try and test it out. Then you have a stable series. Every time window of X, devel becomes stable through some hardening path, right? And then, which you could define, right? You have to do some type of vetting and API machinations and all the other things. And then you go again on the new devel. Devel keeps on trucking.
So, first off, DeWall's waiting for Mike behind you, but before that, like, why isn't anybody using a release of Kubernetes that is cut every 2 weeks? Because we actually do publish builds of Kubernetes every 2 weeks. First they're tagged as alpha, and then they're tagged as beta. Right? Everyone's raising their hand. I wonder if part of it is that we don't build debs or RPMs. Might that be part of it?
Yes.
Right. So hang on. So part of that, I think, is I have heard some people within the project say that is a boundary that maybe the Kubernetes project should not cross, is that we should provide the binaries, but for example, Debian is responsible for packaging all of their own debs that work with them, right? Why wouldn't we look to Debian to actually do downstream builds? Because it seems like what they wanted was they didn't. Our experience in the last time we had a Debian maintainer. You want to talk to Christoph Blecker about this if you haven't. Like we had a Debian maintainer come and be like, it's really difficult. I want to like take your vendor directory and rip it apart and replace it with all of the Debian sanctioned builds of like etcd and Docker and everything else. And we as a project cannot operate that way. Like we kind of have to take responsibility for the sanctity of all of our own dependencies, right? We were just talking about security threats from vendor today. Like we have to take ownership of that. We can't rely on downstream distributors to take ownership of that. So like how do we bridge that particular gap? To me it seems like we say, look, we'll provide you a binary and then it's up to you to provide the deb or RPM.
I think this is just a release tooling problem. It's not hard and it's solved for almost every single distribution provider that exists. They just have streams, right? And if your binary artifacts includes the ability to install those artifacts, whatever they may be, like if they're RPMs or debs or some Byzantine MSI installer, if you really cared to do that, then you could do that. But you just need a regular stream and a cadence.
So as a straw man, what if we changed our binaries to debs every 2 minutes?
Then people would probably, some people, we'll call them crazy people, might actually do that, might actually use it. I got like 3 people here.
So I'm Dawal. I work at VMware. I'm an engineer at VMware, and I'm also co-chair for this working group. I wanted to mention one thing that Tim had brought in the distributors. So is anybody here packaging an application and releasing it as a software on Kubernetes? Because for them, I've heard some people who do that, and for them, this release cadence was, I mean, heard issues that they had. So they could explain, how this impacts them, and if Kubernetes is released every 2 weeks, will they be able to upgrade? And how do you distribute your patches for your software and Kubernetes then?
You're talking as an ISV type role, or as a, yeah, that's what you're asking? Like, am I running the software myself, or am I making it available for other people to run?
You're bundling it and giving it to someone.
Yeah, so we do that. Binami, we do Kube apps and a bunch of other things. It's application software that targets only Kubernetes environment. Sorry, talk to the mic more. Yeah, okay. So it's actually not that hard. So long as we target stable APIs, the API groups, the APIs, they're around for a long time. And they don't change in backwards compatible ways very much. The main issue we have is, very much. The main issue we have is things like client Go. Like you can use a client Go from 4 versions ago and it'll work against those API groups from 4 versions ago, except for authentication plugins. Every time you turn around, there's yet another authentication plugin burnt into client Go. And then along comes EKS, and suddenly you have to upgrade all of your client Go's just to embed the EKS authentication plugin. So that's been a bit of a driver for churn where there's not any other reason for us.
How is your software support? Like when you give it to the customer saying that, okay, it's support only for 9 months, which is Kubernetes, what will be the patch release after 9 months? How do you look at that?
How do we model a support contracts for it? Because we don't,
If there's a critical artifact
we just say it's got to be, we say which versions of Kubernetes we let it run on, we test it against, and then, I'm trying to think how they're actually structured, and then because we don't provide support for the Kubernetes underneath, right? So if they want a supported Kubernetes or whatever, then they've got to stay within the support window for Kubernetes themselves. That's their problem, not ours.
You don't bundle the Kubernetes along with it.
No, we do not bundle Kubernetes with the application.
Okay, that was the perspective
Right.
I was looking at, because there's some people who are doing it, and I heard that perspective.
Yeah, if we're doing the whole stack, then that's a different problem that you'd have to think about.
I just wanted to comment on the stable APIs thing. Like targeting stable APIs is a great way to get yourself working against Kubernetes clusters for as long as possible. I think Tim's point about like having a stable develop branch, if you took out all of the APIs that are not stable yet, you would lose a lot of the APIs that people are using. And so getting the things that people actually rely on from beta to stable is like priority number 1. Whether you end up with an LTS release or not, just from perspective of someone like you who's like, I need a manifest and I need this to work for the next X years. Yes. So like actually getting the APIs to that state is not just like, well, we'll rename them and call them V1. Like some of them are maybe close to that. Some of them still have like scale testing and other issues like that to work through. But then you said the stable APIs don't break, and everybody laughed. And in addition to getting APIs too stable, we need better testing to make sure that we don't regress those stable APIs. And so those two things, getting things too stable and then getting better testing to make sure we don't regress stable, are, in my mind, like #1 priority, regardless of what happens with LTS or not.
Until all the APIs that are really necessary are stable, then having an LTS doesn't really help you. It might actually hurt you.
Sorry. Restate your thing.
If a lot of applications need unstable APIs in order to actually deploy properly, if we go and make an LTS before those things are stabilized, then it will be harder for applications developers to generally target the Kubernetes community because they won't have the functionality stabilized yet. So there is a slight risk of LTSing too soon.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Young, I'm from Atlassian, I'm also a co-chair. And I'm also doing the mic stuff. I'm just, in the interest of time, do other people, is everyone commenting on this, or do other people have other things to raise? Justin, you got anything? Yeah, okay, cool. So who else wants to comment on this? I just want to get an idea of how much longer we have, because, yeah, we need to keep moving. Bob?
Well, I was still back on the previous topic.
Okay,
So,
that's fine.
and like, I feel like I kind of need to ask the stupid question here. So my stupid question is, so the discussion has clearly taken a veer towards early and better release as opposed to LTS, and I understand that there's some linkage between the two, but can someone take a crack at explaining what's the difference between LTS and expanding our current version support from 3 to 4 to 5 releases? I mean, this seems like a fairly simple thing to me, so.
I think it was what Jacob said. What happens at the end of that time? Yeah. So you stay on this thing for a year or a year and a half.
You can either you're supported or it's not. Right? So I would say no. Thanks. Sorry. Either it's supported or it's not. So
and what happens at the end of that support? Like, when we say someone can stay on a version for a year and a half, at the end of that year and a half, what is their path from that to another supported platform? Like, that's the question that in my mind has to be answered.
The existing upgrade path. So
I don't think everyone shares that
no.
view.
Yeah. So, but I mean, skip upgrades. Now, this is not a skip. Sorry, I don't think this is a skip upgrade conversation. You can always upgrade from one version to the next version to the next version. I mean, that seems like orthogonal to this. So.
So I
let's
think the
practical.
critical part is the skips. I think you're right. If we extend to 5 releases
Right.
instead of 3, then it's possible to stay on a supported release for the duration of whatever that calendar time is.
Right.
But then the question becomes, if we agree that you can't skip versions, which I challenge anyone to prove that it's possible to skip versions and be safe. So
I agree.
Assume that we cannot skip versions. Then at least
And be
our
safe.
enterprise customers have a turbulence threshold or appetite that would lead me to believe that they will upgrade only one version. And then they have the exact same cadence of upgrades, just far behind. So maybe I've thought this through as much as I can. Maybe we can bundle it together so it appears to be one upgrade across multiple versions. And we just packaged up real nice so it feels like one upgrade, but it's really lots. I worry across tens of thousands of clusters that goes awry in interesting ways across those number of clusters. But that's one way. Or we have actual migration tooling that means you spin up a new cluster at the most recent stable version and you migrate workloads across them. That I also have a really hard time believing that will work at scale. So, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
If it were my system, so if I would say a couple of principles here. One principle, I think, and if maybe we should set some of these principles as a way to try to clarify things. That kind of upgrade, I think, we should only try to support it in the context of automated pipelines doing this kind of testing. In which case, the skip upgrade path is not, well, first of all, it doesn't have to take that long to do 2 versions. But what it does is it reduces the test matrix that everybody has to do. And in any case, you could always upgrade, and then run your application testing on top. So I don't actually think the skip level thing is as big a barrier to these enterprises. Like when they want to take their painful window to do the upgrade, yeah, they have to do a double upgrade, but they get to do the double upgrade inside it. And if they can't make it, then they can roll back. So I think the no skips path here has some validity. Anyway.
Sorry. The question about certification, if as part of upgrading from 1.x to 1.x plus 5 means that you run 4 versions in between, it would be good to get feedback from companies and customers and environments that do need to only run certified versions. Does that mean they have to get 5 individual versions certified because at any given point in time they are running every single one of those intermediate versions? That's a question about the skip level things.
That actually wasn't what I was saying. I was saying that I wasn't suggesting that the path for the skip upgrade is go to production with 2 versions. It was within the context of qualifying a release through your CI and CD process, that you would do a double upgrade before you did the deployment. So for the use case that I'm sort of advocating here, at least as a thought experiment, you wouldn't put the enterprise in that multi-version certification case, because that's going to be the production case, the production use case, not the upgrade in staging use case.
We're going to need to cut this off soon because we've got some other questions. So can you be quick? Yep.
So I do have one point on this, and that's, so I work with a lot of regulated industries. By the way, hi, I'm Noah. I'm with InfoSifter. Working with defense, working with casinos, working with a handful of very tightly regulated industries. They may not be able to do the individual versions that are in between, because if they have to use a particular version, it has to go through regulatory approval, and then they have to sit there and wait for 6 to 9 months to be able to get that version to go through that upgrade step in the first place. Then people lose their licenses and people are out millions of dollars.
Any other upgrade has some indeterminate state in between going from Windows version 6 to 7, even though they were both certified. Halfway through the upgrade, when you only had some of the bits on the disk and the other bits were still being loaded off the CD-ROM, you didn't certify that situation, right? So you could bundle up, but you could bundle it up in a nice upgrade tool so that they never thought about the intermediate states.
Yeah, so yeah, I think so, but I think, yeah, as they say, the problem there is that you're using like programming logic with people who are just not, yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Mark. I'm from VMware, and I've been working on vSphere for a long time, so I have a lot of experience with customers in weird cases. But I would ask that we identify some set of customers that we care about supporting as Kubernetes, and that may be customers who are running tanks for a year in a battlefield, and they need security updates, but they don't want to do any major version upgrades, or retailers who can't break during Black Friday and the holiday season because they will lose $1 billion, or healthcare companies that cannot upgrade because they may kill someone if they fail to upgrade efficiently. And it's not clear to me which customers Kubernetes cares about supporting. But if we do care about those, then I would identify their needs and try to figure out how to support them.
I think the answer is all of them. That's the problem, right? It is literally in every single industry. So trying to take preferential treatment versus A versus B is super duper hard. And that's part of the reason why Tim started a survey, is because trying to gather the signal through the noise. But I guarantee you, from what I've experienced firsthand across a number of different companies I've worked for, is that it's every industry. And the requirements are wildly different.
Yeah, just to get back to what Aaron said on releasing the binaries, I think that what makes user not really eager to try the binaries that gets released often is that the way that we stabilize our releases is basically at the end. So we get some tests that are broken, things like that. So I think that if we stabilize our CI process, our tests, our code, and if we release often, then yes, users might want to try these binaries. Because last time I wanted to try these pre-releases or release candidates on some development environments, it totally it didn't went well. So I think that's one of the main reasons that users hold off on using these binaries.
I will just be very quick on that. To people who want to use releases where all of the tests actually pass, what I need are developers who will actually help make the tests pass. Like, we have never ever cut a release of Kubernetes where all of the tests pass. Okay?
Sorry, I think we got...
Me or?
I think he has a...
All right.
Quote, so...
I actually didn't want to interrupt Justin, but my observation was just we're not the first people to have to solve this problem. There are many, many big software infrastructures around the world that have been doing this for 50 years. I wonder whether we shouldn't, rather than trying to solve the perfect problem, let's at least try and be as good as what are considered to be reasonably decent upgrade paths that exist out there at the moment. There are, Microsoft has been doing this stuff across desktops for many, many years. Amazon's got internal stuff. I'm sure there are problems with many of these things, but maybe a first step is to be no worse than those. Oracle's been upgrading databases. IBM's been upgrading mainframes. I mean, this is a well-trodden path. So maybe a good starting point is to understand what the status quo in the industry is at the moment, and then at least use that as a starting point rather than start with a blank sheet of paper and figure out how we're going to do this as if nobody else has ever done it before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Justin. I
Go,
wanted
Justin,
to
go.
Yay! It was something that Jago said a while ago about the idea that we could sort of persuade customers that the new version was not different, and it brought into my mind the idea that we've talked about our API versioning, but this means that we essentially have to keep our feature set more or less the same. We can't upgrade to Core DNS, we can't upgrade to IPVS, we can't upgrade Docker, and whether we call it the LTS, where we add security releases to an older version, is a way of implementing that, as would be a long-term stream where we say we will support this feature set and will not deprecate it for a longer period than our current deprecation period, whether it's 2 years or something like that. And I don't know whether that would help the problem, and I don't know whether we're willing to do that and lock our feature set or commit to a feature set that we have today.
I'm going to abuse my mic privileges now to talk. My feeling there is that's what Jordan was saying before. Like you move the APIs to stable, and once they're stable, then you have that. That is literally the guarantee of a stable API, of a GA API, is that it doesn't change anymore.
There's been a lot of discussion on what should be conformance testing. I feel like those kind of dovetail a bit. How are people getting more comfortable? I know there's been a lot of conversation about conformance. Again, it's one of those places where you need hands on deck. But, and going back maybe to the earlier comment, like I really doubt anybody is saying that we're ready to make an LTS now, like too soon. I don't think is actually a problem. I think we're all pretty much agreeing that now is clearly too soon. But sometime in the future, maybe we're into a better place. But that's why we start talking about it now, I think. But do people feel like we could achieve that in 6, 9, 18 months? Like where would people throw a number out on how much work our current community with its pace of things would take?
I think the answer to that is we need a checklist on what are the things that we need to do to get ready for an LTS. And when we check them off, then we are ready. That's the time when we would do the first one. And what Jordan said was like item number 1 on the checklist. But there are some other things that we need to do as well, including making sure that the release process, artifacts, signing, things like that have to be lined up as well. So once that is done, I mean, if you want me to name a time, it would take at least 6 months to 9 months if a lot of people in this room are willing to help. That's part of the usual problem that we have where, people want a lot of stuff, but then we need to coordinate the work and we need to make sure that everybody can show up and we have a role for them and we know what we need from them.
I think Bob was next.
Yeah, let me try to take a little bit different perspective on this. So I think the status quo is really horrible and miserable. Companies move too slow. One of the reasons why Kubernetes, and in fact containerization in general, has been adopted as vigorously as it has been, is companies, including all these companies, a lot of older school IT companies that I'll say they think they want LTS, but the reason they're moving to these kinds of systems is to try to improve their velocity. And I really am worried that what we're doing here is we're really sort of falling into a trap of enabling the behaviors that are the reason that these companies are trying to move in this direction to begin with. And I feel pretty passionately that we have to figure out not how to help people stay on old software for longer and longer and longer periods of time, but how to help them figure out how to go through the rapid upgrade process, build their systems, their practices, understand what it means to live in this kind of cloud-native, immutable, pipeline-driven way. And as a community, I really feel like if we can't help our user community adopt that way of working, as opposed to falling into the habits that got them into the trouble that they were in to begin with, we'll eventually, we'll eventually sort of collapse back into something that's waiting for the next system to come along. I know that's super philosophical, but something I know that we're very passionate about. Thanks.
Tim is like itching for the mic. It's like a reflex. I'll give it to you in just a second. I agree with that. The questions that Justin raised about like what versions of Docker, what versions of etcd, we've switched to Core DNS, all of those are like those speak to us and we speak to them through APIs. I think it's all about what APIs do we test, the conformance tests that we have. So I talked about REST APIs, like the things that people are writing manifests for. That is one dimension. We have 3 dimensions of APIs. We have the REST APIs, we have the config APIs, which we're trying to get flags into, and then we have the backend APIs like CNI, CRI, CSI, so many C's and I's. And if we think in terms of APIs, how users speak to the API server, how you configure those components, and how they shell out to, not shell, dear Lord, no, how they call out to the backends, those things we can actually test. Those things we can actually get to stable and keep stable. And I think that is, I said, stable APIs are priority 1. In my mind, that's all 3 of those areas. The REST APIs are the most visible, but the other 2, I think, would put us in a much better place going forward. So we can promise if your container runtime supports this version of the CRI, we test that and we work with that. All right, now you can.
Just one more time, because we only have a few minutes left. If anybody hasn't had a chance to say anything yet and wants to.
So while you're passing the mic over, so this is a cultural problem, not a technological or strategy problem. So the problem is culture, like Sarah famously quoted, like in KubeCon in Austin, is culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So the problem is changing culture is super duper hard, and I don't exactly know how you do that. I don't think anyone does, but in order for us to do that, we need to live the mantra that we are trying to espouse, and making tests actually be passing in green all the time is one of the ways of doing that. So if we want to tell the community to move faster, and we need to give them good reason and live the mantra that we're talking about.
So I'm Simone from VMware, and actually, I mean, I see your point. You're building the software, so you see there's a lot of more features that needs to be added, and then you think the customer, to be able to move faster, they need to use this feature. But what about if I'm a customer and the features that I have today with 1.13 are already enough for me? I'm already moving much faster than before with this version of Kubernetes. I just want to have somebody that will support me for a year, for 2 years, because I'm happy with this one. I'm already deploying my software happy. I deployed in a tank or an hospital. I just want to be able to call somebody like a year from now that will actually help me out if there is a bug or if the system goes down or something. So I think we need to think about those people as well.
Which is what happens at the end of that support period question.
Yeah, so, sorry, just to jump in there for a second. Part of the reason that, that the other guys asked me to be one of the co-chairs is that that's me. Like, I am an operator. I don't write a lot of code on the Cube project. I am here to represent all of those people. That is literally my job is in this working group, is to be the guy who's like, but what about the end users?
I just wanted to suggest that it's interesting that KubeCon happens or KubeCon North America is a December event. It's interesting because retail customers are typically in their freeze period, and we ourselves as providers are often in our own freeze periods. And the trend that I see continuing is that large enterprises tend to hold off on a lot of upgrades towards the end of the year. And what we in GKE are in a position where we will do multiple sort of faster upgrades through the beginning part of the year. And so maybe we can use this as a learning experience to inform the multiple faster upgrades over a short period of time and trend in that direction such that at least the support window stretches so that what is in production for many enterprise customers is still security scanned and patched, and we go back a little bit. I don't know if that's a dangerous precedent to set, but it may be a way to gain some incremental knowledge.
So I think I hear different, whenever you start a topic, I mean, sometimes we get into solutions, someone describes a problem. So I think the survey that we have is trying to cover questions that will get us the list of problems that we want to solve. Tim's question, Tim Pepper's, there are too many Tims in the room. So Tim Pepper's question was, how much time, can we solve this problem? I mean, the first thing is we need to start defining the problems and the list we want to solve, and then build a checklist, as Dim's mentioned, to say that, okay, these are the things that we need to solve those problems. And if we start looking at, okay, first problem solved with these three things in the checklist solved. So I think a systematic approach there would help. And the survey, it's trying to collect that information. And the link that you see is of a doc that says, this is the wording of the survey. Do you think it covers your perspective? So I think if you guys can contribute to that survey and the comments around that survey, that would help represent your question and your perspective also.
I'll pull that back up. So the reason I asked the time was because I wanted people to leave here not just having had this awesome, wide open conversation, but to think about, we're talking about something for a better future, right? But when could that be? And we can be here again next year talking about having the same conversation, but I feel like without something for a concrete goal, so getting the survey out, starting to develop the criteria, thinking about doing that sort of this quarter, next quarter, having the next level then more robust conversation about it at KubeCon in the spring, trying to drive towards concrete actions to achieve things on a timeline without saying like, hey, we would like to be in a better place, whatever it turns out to be, maybe multiple prongs to it as well, but could we end next year at KubeCon saying we've actually moved the needle on this stuff?
Yeah.
That also feels ambitious, but if we don't think about KubeCon next year, we're not going to be there in a better state.
So for some of my own applications, I've got 2 holes in the Kubernetes API that I'm working on trying to finally get solved in 1.14, which means there'll be alpha in 1.14 and there'll be beta in 1.15, which means it needs to be LTS in at least 16, right? There's a long tail on getting stuff through the API process. So a year?
I agree. We need to have the broader strategical conversation that's far-reaching. That's why I +1 to this proposal when it wasn't WG LTS. It was, what are we LTSing, and what does LTS even mean, and why are we talking about this?
Yeah.
Because that's the conversation this group
I
needs
think
to have.
that is super important to emphasize that this is not a working group to make an LTS. This is a working group to be like, do we even want an LTS, and what the hell is an LTS, and a whole bunch of other questions. It's just much shorter to write WG LTS than a 20-letter acronym, right?
Yeah. So this is somewhat reminiscent of when we all got in a room about 1.5 to 2 years ago and said, you know what? This is the year of making Kubernetes stable. Mission accomplished, right? So that said, I feel like we have said some very discrete, accomplishable things in this room. To me, Jordan's stake in the ground of we need to move the APIs that people are actually using to make their real applications to stable is the goal, is a great goalpost. I feel like a year is, roughly speaking, going to get us some appreciable level of functionality. I don't know if it's going to be 100%, but it's going to be very close. I also personally want to put a stake in the ground for like what can we accomplish in the next quarter in terms of making it easier to exercise releases, or how can we consider making upgrades easier. Part of that might be, for example, using the KEP process that was described earlier and will be talked about in the conference, where like for everything that's going to land in Kubernetes, can I make sure there's actually a written documented plan that talks about what the upgrade path is and what the downgrade path is, and that the end user has actually been kept in mind? Because I don't see that at company releases until like the very end. And I want a lot of thought to be put into that at the very front, so that the release team isn't scrambling to try and figure all of this out, that the people who have the technical knowledge on these features have considered it up front. And so I think all of, oh, and finally, could we please actually maybe cut one release of Kubernetes where all of the tests have passed? That would be great. I mean, yeah. So I call all of this out. I saw Tim writing them down. Like, I think we should aspire to at least that. All of those things are accomplishable by the people in this room.
Again, remember, the survey.
Yes.
Everybody, like, we are way past time. We're currently 5 minutes over time, so we are cutting into your break time. So I really appreciate all the feedback, but the survey is the place for the feedback. Please, please help us with the questions. Once the questions are done, answer the survey. Like, all of this stuff has been awesome, but if it's not going to be ended up written down, then we won't remember.